GM and Ford currently give a profit-sharing check to hourly workers based on pre-tax profits in North America.
Ford's dirty secret has just been exposed, and it's worse than you could imagine. They've been hiding fire risks, brake failures, and steering malfunctions, all while knowing the dangers. Now, the truth is coming out, and it's not just a corporate cover-up. It's your safety and trust on the line. How many lives have been at risk because of their silence? Why did they wait so long to act? And what does this mean for the future of Ford? By the time this video ends, you'll understand. It's not just their reputation at stake, it's yours. The recall Ford hoped you'd ignore. Ford just told over 1 million drivers not to start their engines, but waited months to say why. It began as a trickle. An owner here, a mechanic there, reporting glitches in the rear-view camera systems of late-model Fords. Screens froze unexpectedly. Reverse visuals blacked out mid-turn. At first, it looked like a software hiccup, but as complaints flooded into NHTSA and Ford service centers, it became impossible to deny. This wasn't isolated, it was systemic. The issue, tied to faulty processing software, compromised visibility on backup cameras across some of Ford's most popular vehicles, including the F-150, Mustang, and Explorer. The scale was staggering. By the time Ford finally acknowledged the problem, over 1 million vehicles were implicated. But what stunned industry observers wasn't just the size of the recall, it was how long Ford waited. Internal documents later revealed that engineers flagged the issue as early as the previous fall, yet the formal recall wasn't initiated until months later, following federal pressure and mounting public frustration. Even then, Ford downplayed the severity, issuing vague statements and avoiding media scrutiny. It was only after the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration slapped Ford with a $165 million penalty for delay that the truth emerged. Ford had knowingly left drivers vulnerable, prioritizing optics over safety. Before the headlines could cool off, a new fire hazard brought fear to people's front doors, literally. If what you just heard made you pause, hit that like button. It helps more people see the truth Ford hoped would stay buried. And tell us in the comments, have you been affected by a Ford recall? We're reading every story, and your voice could push this scandal into the spotlight where it belongs. Trucks that could catch fire in your driveway. What if your family SUV was a rolling bonfire? Hundreds of Ford owners are now asking that same question. In a quiet suburb of Illinois, the Lewis family awoke to a horrifying scene. Their 2-month-old Ford Escape smoldering in the driveway, flames curling from under the hood. Firefighters later traced the cause to a fuel leak near the engine block. What they didn't know was that hundreds of similar cases were already logged, and Ford had been watching the list grow. In total, nearly 700,000 Bronco Sport and Escape models were recalled after it was discovered that cracked fuel injectors were spraying gasoline directly onto hot engine surfaces. Ford admitted that even when the engines were off, residual pressure in the fuel lines could trigger spontaneous leaks. Worse, early signs of failure were often undetectable to the average driver. The company tried to calm fears with an over-the-air patch meant to detect pressure loss. But by then, multiple fires had already occurred. One Detroit safety analyst described the patch as digital duct tape, a flimsy stopgap in place of physical corrections. Lawsuits began emerging. Families shared stories of cars igniting in garages, in traffic, even while parked at schools. A child was nearly burned when a fire broke out during pickup, yet Ford hesitated to issue a full-stop "do not drive" order, instead framing the risk as low probability. While families feared fires in their driveways, another threat was already tearing down highways at 70 miles an hour. Steering failure at 70 miles per hour? It happened. One Ford driver reported their steering wheel locked up mid-curve, and they weren't alone. It sounds like a nightmare scenario. You're on the highway, doing 70. When the steering suddenly goes dead. That's exactly what happened to Alan Ortiz while driving his F-150 Lightning through a construction zone outside Phoenix. "It just stopped responding," he said. "I had to wrestle it into the shoulder before I crashed." He wasn't the only one. Ford issued a recall for select Lightning and Mach-E vehicles after reports of steering systems going unresponsive under certain driving conditions. The failure stemmed from a software malfunction in the power control unit, an invisible but critical component that guides the steering assist motor. When it glitched, the car didn't just hesitate, it went limp. At least 10 incidents were reported before Ford acted. One involved a family of 5 narrowly avoiding a collision on an interstate ramp. Another left a driver stranded for over an hour on a mountain pass with no signal, no help, and a vehicle that refused to turn. Investigations revealed that Ford's engineers had flagged the risk during development, but final stage testing was rushed under executive pressure to meet EV launch timelines. Just as drivers were bracing for impact, dealers across the country started sounding their own silent alarm. The dealer lots that stopped moving, full rows of untouched trucks, silent showrooms, and one question dealers couldn't ignore: what's Ford hiding? In Texas, you can spot the trouble from the highway. Dozens of Ford dealers sit with their lots packed. Hundreds of F-150s, Super Duties, and Explorers lined up like forgotten inventory. This isn't post-pandemic supply chaos. This is the fallout of something deeper, a shift in trust, a collapse in confidence. Dealerships across the country are reporting stagnating sales and canceled allocations. Many say customers are hesitant, not just because of interest rates or price hikes, but because of the headlines. They come in and ask about the recalls, said one Colorado dealer. They're nervous, and they should be. One Ford partner described the situation bluntly. We're sitting on a time bomb of unsold trucks, and Ford's still shipping them out. To make matters worse, pull-forward demand during the tariff panic earlier in the year led Ford to flood lots with inventory. But now, as that artificial demand fades, vehicles are piling up. Add quality concerns, rising insurance rates, and consumer fatigue, and the picture gets grim. 1 in 5 buyers now face $1,000 monthly payments. Many are walking away. The problem wasn't just the danger, it was the deliberate silence behind it. Inside the recall machine, how Ford buried the pattern. One recall every 3 days, and no one at Ford pressed pause. Why? In the span of 12 months, Ford shattered an industry record, and not the good kind. 88 recalls were issued across their lineup, affecting millions of vehicles. From SUVs to electric trucks, the defects piled up faster than they could be fixed. A safety analyst at a national watchdog group described the trend as a company spiraling under the weight of its own denial. And yet, despite the flood of safety notices, Ford never acknowledged a systemic issue. Digging deeper, data from NHTSA filings showed something troubling. Many recalls were repeat offenders. Vehicles already recalled once were returning for new problems in the same systems. Software patches were rolled out, only to be followed by hardware fixes weeks later. Some vehicles were recalled 3 times in a year, but Ford refused to sound any internal alarms. Instead, each recall was treated like a standalone mistake, a one-off error rather than part of a deeper pattern. It was only when external researchers charted the trends publicly that pressure began to build. Reporters noted the recall pace outmatched every other automaker. Safety advocates warned it pointed to a cultural rot within Ford's product development pipeline. But inside the company, radio silence. Once you follow the numbers, you start to see the strategy, and it's worse than anyone expected. They chose profits over fixes. Top executives weighed the cost of fixing a safety problem, then decided it wasn't worth it. Behind the glass walls of Ford's executive suite, the recalls weren't seen as a safety crisis. They were seen as a math problem. Internal sources describe closed-door meetings where software bugs and design flaws were measured not in risk, but in liability. One manager proposed delaying a critical update to Mach-E power steering software. Why? Because fixing it meant halting production during a profitable sales window. Quarterly earnings reports were prioritized over recall timelines. In one case, a steering defect flagged by quality engineers was shelved for 2 quarters, while vehicles continued to ship. The justification? Delays would disrupt investor confidence. The calculation wasn't safety versus failure, said one corporate insider. It was safety versus stock price. Jim Farley, Ford's CEO, publicly stated that the company was investing in quality, but internal memos told a different story, one where audit teams were under-resourced, risk analysts were ignored, and defect reports were reworded before reaching compliance committees. It wasn't negligence, it was strategy. Those who dared to challenge that strategy paid a price, and one engineer paid the highest. The whistleblower who disappeared. He flagged a software error tied to hundreds of incidents. 2 weeks later, his access was revoked. Marcus Ellison, a contract software engineer assigned to Ford's electric vehicle diagnostics division, noticed something odd. A recurring fault code linked to the power steering module on the F-150 Lightning kept triggering false clears, meaning the system would report all clear while the issue remained unresolved. He reported it through the standard channels. Silence. A week later, he followed up with a more detailed report. 2 days after that, he was locked out of his systems. Marcus wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He kept backups of the reports, screen captures of test results, and time-stamped change logs. Then he vanished. His co-workers were told his contract expired. But months later, encrypted files bearing his initials appeared on a watchdog server used by industry whistleblowers. Inside the files, clear evidence that Ford had received more than 400 internal notifications about the fault. yet took no public action until a recall was forced. The leaked documents included redacted internal chats naming senior compliance officers. One message read, "We don't flag until external pressure hits." Another warned, "If we go early on this, it undermines our EV rollout." The implications were staggering, not just for Ford, but for every regulatory body watching. When the truth reached Washington, denial wasn't an option anymore. Washington finally noticed. Ford just got hit with $165 million in fines, and that was the easy part. In a blistering announcement, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration declared that Ford had violated federal reporting requirements by delaying safety recalls, particularly in the case of rear-view camera malfunctions. The penalty, one of the largest ever levied, was just the beginning. Regulators also announced open investigations into Ford's handling of steering and brake system failures. In Washington, whispers of criminal oversight charges began circulating behind closed doors. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle expressed outrage. A congressional subcommittee was formed to investigate Ford's recall management, and subpoenas were issued for internal communications between compliance officers and executive leadership. Senator Valerie Reyes of Michigan, herself a former auto worker, didn't mince words. This isn't just a corporate mistake, it's a betrayal of public trust. For years, Ford's legacy had given it protection, politically, culturally, and economically, but that goodwill was now evaporating. The automaker's recall record was on track to surpass every competitor by the end of the year. Its stock price wobbled, investor confidence slipped, and consumer loyalty in freefall. Regulators moved in, but the real pressure came from the people who had everything to lose. The dad who couldn't open his doors. His toddler screamed from the back seat, but the doors wouldn't open. It happened in the middle of a Florida heat wave. Marcus Hines, a 34-year-old father of two, returned from a grocery run and loaded his daughter into the back seat of his brand-new Ford Mustang Mach-E. Minutes later, the car locked itself down, unresponsive to the key fob, touchscreen, or even the emergency manual release. Trapped inside, his daughter began crying. Then she screamed, and still, the doors stayed shut. What Marcus didn't know at the time was that Ford had already identified the door latch malfunction weeks earlier. Thousands of Mach-E owners had experienced lockout events due to electronic door control failures. Software glitches that rendered the touch-sensitive latches useless. In some cases, drivers were trapped inside. In others, they couldn't get in at all. Ford delayed the recall, citing the need for diagnostic confirmation. By the time the notice was finally issued, more than 100,000 vehicles were affected. But the problem didn't stop there. Lawsuits were filed. Emergency responders had to break windows to remove children in several reported cases. Drivers posted frantic videos on social media, begging for answers. Still, Ford held firm. Low probability, low severity. While one father begged for answers, inside the boardroom, the warnings became a joke. Executives laughed at the risk models. The report called it critical. The execs called it noise. That decision nearly killed someone. Inside Ford's product safety division, a pattern had begun to emerge. Risk modeling reports flagged repeated failures in brake pressure sensors on full-size SUVs. One report issued in early spring labeled the probability of failure as unacceptably high. A recommendation was made: halt deliveries of affected models until a fix could be implemented. Instead, the recommendation was buried. An insider from the finance team leaked internal emails to a consumer watchdog group. The thread showed senior executives mocking the warning. "Tell the engineers to stop crying wolf," one message read. Another simply stated, "The model's too sensitive. Looks worse than it is." Weeks later, an F-150 with the flagged defect rear-ended a stalled vehicle on the freeway. The brakes had failed at the worst possible moment. The company's response was clinical and cold. "We are investigating," a spokesperson told reporters, but the investigation was internal. No external audit was invited. Employees who asked questions were told to stand down. It wasn't just that they ignored the data, the insider explained. They treated it like a threat to their quarterly bonus. That laughter wouldn't last, because the legal firestorm was already building. Lawsuit Nation. Drivers strike back. Over 20 plaintiffs, 6 legal teams. One goal: make Ford finally pay. When the first lawsuit was filed in Chicago, it barely made headlines. A single family suing Ford for a steering defect on a Lightning EV. But within weeks, others followed. Brake failure claims, lockout cases, rear-view camera crashes. By midsummer, the cases had stacked into a wave. Attorneys across the country were coordinating efforts to bring class action suits against Ford, claiming negligence, concealment, and in some cases, reckless endangerment. Among the most harrowing was the case of Maria Delgado, whose Bronco Sport caught fire while idling at a traffic light. She barely escaped. The cause? A cracked fuel injector Ford had already identified internally, but hadn't recalled her VIN in time. Her legal team's filing included damning internal records obtained from a whistleblower. The message? Ford knew. They waited, and people got hurt. The lawsuits weren't just about money. They were about accountability. Courtrooms became battlegrounds, with plaintiffs demanding answers and Ford attorneys deflecting blame. In several states, motions were filed to force executive depositions. Judges began granting discovery rights to internal recall memos. For the first time, Ford's defense walls were starting to crack. Lawsuits hit the courthouse. But on Capitol Hill, the real confrontation was just getting started. Congress calls Ford to the stand. The last time Ford was here, someone died. This time, it's about who knew what and when. The hearing room was packed. Camera lights flooded the panel. And at the center, Ford CEO Jim Farley took his seat. It had been over a decade since Ford executives were summoned for public testimony. But this time, the stakes were higher. Senators had in hand printed pages of recall data, leaked emails, and consumer complaints. Their questions were pointed and sharp. Why were vehicles with known steering failures allowed to remain on the road? Why did Ford delay notifying the public after multiple fire incidents? Who approved the decision to prioritize earnings over emergency software patches? Farley's answers were polished, but the tension was visible. Lawmakers cited reports showing Ford had the worst recall rate of any automaker in the country. They grilled the company over its growing list of lawsuits. Some demanded new regulations. Others called for criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. One representative from California simply held up a photo, a burned-out Bronco surrounded by yellow tape. For Ford, the hearing was more than reputational damage. It was the start of regulatory upheaval. Investigators left with subpoena power. New legislation loomed, and trust in the brand, once rooted in American identity, was now deeply fractured. Congress demanded answers, but the consequences were already rippling far beyond Washington. The salesman left in the dust. Ford kept pushing trucks, but the buyers disappeared. Now salesmen are watching their careers collapse. It started as a slowdown, then silence. Inside Ford dealerships across the United States, rows of unsold F-150s and Super Duty trucks began to gather dust. Showroom floors once buzzing with test drives and weekend deals went quiet. Salesmen who used to close 5, 10, sometimes even 15 deals a week were now staring at empty calendars. And it wasn't just a bad month, it was a breaking point. Many dealerships had taken on massive allocations in the first half of the year, encouraged by Ford's aggressive forecasts. But those forecasts ignored a chilling reality. Consumer trust was collapsing. Recalls had shaken confidence. So had headlines about steering failures, fire hazards, and delayed alerts. As one Florida dealer put it, they told us to stock up. Now we're stuck with metal we can't move. Cancellations from buyers became common. Some dealerships began refusing new inventory shipments altogether. Lease rates soared, resale values plummeted, and salesmen who once made six figures now questioned their future. Behind closed doors, regional managers urged teams to weather the storm. But for many, the damage was done. The brand felt tainted. While salesmen watched their paychecks evaporate, global automakers started rewriting their war plans. The global car war reignites. One recall triggered a tariff war. The fallout? Entire EV strategies are being rewritten. It began as a domestic scandal, but it didn't stay there. Within weeks of the first congressional hearings, global markets took notice. European regulators began questioning the safety compliance of Ford imports. In Asia, officials warned that automakers cutting corners would face stricter scrutiny. And in Washington, protectionist voices grew louder. The result? Tariff threats returned with a vengeance. Policymakers pushed to penalize automakers who failed safety standards or outsourced production to countries with weaker oversight. Ford, already reeling from its recall disaster, now faced the very real possibility of losing access to key EV growth markets. Canada considered slapping import restrictions on affected models. The European Union debated limiting tax incentives for U.S. automakers entirely. But the biggest blow came from within, the collapse of the EV credit framework. As trust in automaker reporting faded, lawmakers moved to rework clean vehicle incentives, requiring stricter domestic sourcing and transparent compliance records. For Ford, this meant billions of dollars in projected support vanished overnight. As competitors in China and Germany seized the moment to expand into disillusioned markets, Ford's international strategy fell into chaos. In the middle of the chaos, one group decided they weren't staying silent anymore. Ford's own workers. The workers who said enough. They said, no more shortcuts, and they meant it. On the floor of Ford's assembly plants, the mood shifted from tension to rage. Workers had long known that speed came before safety. Rushed timelines, last-minute design tweaks, and now the cost was being measured in lawsuits, recalls, and lost jobs. At the Dearborn plant, it started with whispers of a walkout. By the following week, entire shifts staged coordinated slowdowns. The United Auto Workers Union seized the momentum. Publicly, they condemned Ford's leadership for prioritizing profits over people. Privately, they demanded sweeping changes to quality assurance protocols. One veteran line worker summed it up: "They want us to slap these trucks together, then act surprised when the brakes fail. We're not doing it anymore." Protests spread to other facilities. At Ford's EV plant in Tennessee, workers rallied around signs reading, "Stop the spin, fix the system." Inside the plants, productivity metrics plummeted as morale dropped. Executives tried to calm tensions with vague promises and PR campaigns, but the message from workers was clear. Until quality control improved, the line would not run like it used to. The factories stood up, but the final blow came for someone else, the everyday driver. You've made it this far because you know this matters, so subscribe right now. This isn't the last recall, the last cover-up, or the last time corporate decisions risk lives. We're tracking every twist, every betrayal, and the moment it breaks, you'll want to be the first to know. Don't miss what's coming next. Now it's your wallet at risk. You thought this was just Ford's problem? Think again. Your next bill might prove otherwise. The ripple effect didn't end with lawyers or workers. It landed squarely in the lives of everyday people. Owners of recalled Ford models began noticing something alarming. Their insurance premiums were going up, some by 10%, others by more than 30%. One Virginia family saw a hike of over $600 per year, just because they owned a Bronco Sport. Resale values also took a nosedive. Kelley Blue Book estimates showed that certain Ford models depreciated twice as fast as they had before the recall storm hit. Used car buyers grew wary. Dealerships quietly slashed trade-in offers, and loan officers flagged Ford VINs as higher-risk assets, affecting approval rates and interest terms. Meanwhile, Wall Street responded with brutal precision. Ford stock slid more than 18% across the quarter. Analysts revised their outlooks downward, citing mounting legal costs and regulatory uncertainty. Mutual funds and retirement accounts with heavy Ford exposure began to wobble. The message was simple. This wasn't an isolated corporate blunder. It was an industry-wide warning. Auto lenders adjusted their models, anticipating higher default rates. Credit scores took hits. People who had nothing to do with the recalls began feeling the financial aftershocks. What started as a secret inside Ford now threatens to reshape the entire auto industry. This wasn't just about Ford. It was about how far a company will go to protect its image, even if it means risking your safety. If this video opened your eyes, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now. We're not done exposing the truth. Share this with someone who drives, someone who trusts, someone who deserves to know. Because next time, it might not be a recall, it could be a disaster. And if no one's watching, nothing changes. But if enough of us are, everything does. Stay alert, stay informed, and we'll keep holding power to account, one story at a time.